So this week, Group 3 completed the data meeting number 2 for EDTC 615. So for the context of our data meeting 2, we're using the high school data team. And luckily, 2 of us are geometry teachers. One was the algebra teacher, and one is a physics teacher, and kind of in this makeshift data meeting. The data used, we used chapter test scores for geometry students, supplied by one of the geometry teachers as a macro data. And the exploratory question we were looking at was why were the chapter 10 test scores significantly lower than other tests? What material and concepts were covered? Is there a better way to go about presenting the information? In our explanation, we used Google Hangouts, Google Docs, Google Sheets, and Slides to meet, conducting live conferences, and to consolidate artifacts and information and complete the artifact tracking sheet. We met 2 different times during the week. We met Friday on June 17th from 2 p.m. to 2:30 p.m. to kind of get an idea of what artifacts each person would bring and how we would kind of do the overall preparation for the meeting. Then Sunday, we actually conducted the data meeting from 7 p.m. to 8 p.m. where we worked together to discuss the artifacts and complete our artifact tracking sheet in Google Docs. And we took the time to share or look over the artifacts together and really come up with the different category, whether it was instructional or learning gap, and then also the relevance and prominence of each artifact. Here's our artifact tracking sheet that we completed. We completed in Google Docs and used kind of highlighting, and we had a lot of different materials and artifacts that people brought, and you can see that we kind of rated it on different systems according to the information from the book. Here's some of the artifacts. We'll kind of go through them that we identified breaking down that table. The first one was supplied by Anna, and we had the instructional gap where it shows kind of an instructional calendar, and we kind of put in there the different things that we were seeing. For instance, there was only 10 days with 1 quiz and 1 test, and kind of hypothesizing that this could be a reason for one of the exploratory questions to explore further. Her second one, she was supplied some of the lesson plans and notes from her class, and looking at the percentage of the notes that were just copied, and then what percentage of the notes were practice problems for students to try individually. And we identified that as an instructional gap. Here is the artifact that she supplied to us, showing us part of the notes that she was using and what was causing this chapter 10 to be a little bit harder in the context of the in her artifact number 3, we looked at the types of questions that were on this chapter 10 test, and kind of pointing out that the multiple choice was kind of lacking in that there was a lot of short answer vocabulary and fill-in charts, but very few multiple choice in her format of the test question. Artifact 4, we looked at the different chapter tests, especially the 4 last tests of the year, and seeing a significant drop over the percentages. And we had some discussion about this, and we kind of went with the instructional gap, but maybe we're unclear if it would be considered learning gap or instructional gap, but different artifacts used in this triangulation of the exploratory questions and ways to handle it. The 5th one, we looked at the quiz scores on the similarity and right triangles. This was a learning gap looking at the quiz average, and we rated this as a relevance of 5 and prominence of 3, meaning that it was kind of 50-50, half the students kind of got it, half the students didn't really get it, and that we saw that students were performing lower on this quiz, especially when compared to the overall macro data that we started with. These are some of my artifacts that I created, and this is one of them that I also supplied an instructional calendar, and that we looked at this as an instructional gap where there's a low amount of time on individual practice and formative assessment, especially in the context of real-world problems that we're probably going to be seeing in a chapter 10 or in a very similar setting. In the next one, I provided an artifact of instructional presentations. This is only a few of the slides because it was a multi-page document with all the instruction based on similar triangles in the same concepts of right triangles. And looking at this, we concluded that there was not enough time on the simplifying radicals or the real-world applications. For number 8, we had test items. These were actually questions pulled from a unit test given to students. And we identified this as an instructional gap where the different question types There's different question types they're not used to. For instance, looking at typing in. These were computerized questions that were maybe harder for students. And also that students were not used to using multiple choice problems from instruction and the simplified radical form. Artifact number 9 was the unit test data table. So instead of just providing the unit test, we looked at what answers students were looking at and which questions individually caused problems. We identified this as a learning gap where there was poor performance on real-world application problems and problems using simplified radical form. We rated that as a relevance of 4, that this could be a major issue with the overall scheme of why our exploratory question. We have a prominence of 3 because it was about 50-50 on the very problematic ones where half the students kind of got it and half the students did according to the data. This was actually the table where it shows the question number. These are only the multiple choice questions. It shows the number of students that completed each question and the mean or the average percent right on each question, as well as the answer choices selected that are noticed by the asterisk there. For artifact 10, this is the end of the data table for the end of the year that shows the last 4 major unit tests from my geometry class. We identified this as a instructional gap similar to Anna's data table for the last few tests at the end of the year, in that we can see a very significant decrease on the last tests as we kind of end the year out. For artifact number 11, this was supplied by Natalie, I believe, and quiz scores on the algebra and solving proportions. So this is coming from a different context that she was our algebra teacher in the group, in that we identified her proportions quiz average, which are really necessary in the scheme of similar triangles that was tested in this chapter 10. And we identified as a learning gap where there's a low understanding of the material and really with the distributive property in solving these. And since these proportions are really used throughout similar triangles, we had a relevance of 5 and a prominence of 4, and she supplied us with the quiz average and also some of the samples of the different quiz questions that were used to come up with that average. For artifact 12, we looked at some of the math vocabulary, thinking this could be something that was problematic for students, is the vocabulary that's associated with similar triangles. And we identified this as a learning gap with poor understanding with algebra vocabulary and understanding in the context of real-world problems. Again, we had this as a high relevance and prominence because of this vocabulary is critical to being able to do the chapter 10 material and being able to solve those problems. And here is just kind of a vocabulary quiz that was used by Natalie or supplied by Natalie, where looking at some of the different math vocabulary and maybe these are some of the issues that students are having problems with. She also supplied end of the year performance from algebra, looking at her last 3 test scores. And we identified this again as an instructional gap, where that we're seeing that students are performing lower towards the end of the year compared to the beginning units and earlier on in the year. And I believe artifact number 14, we had individual student data. This is from our physics teacher, Danny, in that he looked at a unit test, or sorry, an individual student test that displays a learning gap where student or member of geometry class performed lower on questions related to triangular properties. And since this chapter 10 was based on similar triangles, having problems with triangles might be a big issue. But the student performed well in other class material, and since we came across this, the relevance was 5, again looking at using triangles in general, but with a prominence of 2 that maybe it's not related to this overall chapter 10, and that it was only a few students having problems with this. The artifact number 15, the end of the year data table, we looked at as well. This data table had the 4 last unit tests in his honors physics class, and we identified this as an instructional gap, and that we're seeing that there's a trend again towards the end of the year where students are kind of falling lower and lower towards the end of the year. In artifact number 16, we looked at vocabulary data based on engineering, identifying this as a learning gap where students in this target geometry class are performing poorly on vocabulary mastery and principles of engineering. So thinking again that this might be a cause that the vocabulary is causing the issues in this overall exploratory questions. And we rated this again as a relevance of 4, thinking the vocabulary is kind of causing issues here, but with a prominence of 3, that it's kind of in the middle of students are getting it or not getting it, or understanding or not learning it. And I believe this is the vocabulary test that he was using to test different vocabulary skills in his engineering class. Throughout this, we used only a few resources. The big resource was our book, How Teachers Can Turn Data into Action, that we used for the overall process to figure out the tasks and this process of collecting artifacts for triangulation in the overall scheme of it. And we also referenced the many meanings of multiple measures. That was another reading for the week. And these are the 2 main resources that we used as a group to kind of lead us into this data meeting and complete the artifact tracking sheet. In the overall scheme, we had many more strengths and weaknesses after conducting another data meeting. For our strengths, we really enjoyed conducting the pre-meeting to set the tasks, goals, and types of artifacts we were going to be collecting. Even though it required us to meet twice actually this week, it helped us kind of get on the same page and know what we were doing. We also started early in the week that we held that meeting on Friday and set that meeting up, and so we had a lot of time to prepare our artifacts for the actual data meeting and get it done in an earlier fashion. We also set specific tasks and deadlines for each other. For instance, we knew at the conclusion of our meeting on Friday what artifacts people were going to be bringing, and that we needed those prepared for our Sunday data meeting on Sunday at 7. So everyone had the idea that my artifacts had to be in sometime before that and be ready to go and to distribute those and review those prior to. And then at the conclusion of data meeting 2, we also set a goal to help each other make these slides for myself, the consolidator, that everyone would take an option or take the time to make their own slides and compose them into Google Slides so I could present this information as a summary. We set a good deadline for Monday at 8 p.m., giving me enough time to review over the slides and record the video for the summary this week. For our weaknesses this week, unfortunately, we were unable to attend the video conference with the professor. And we decided as a group, that was kind of a weakness in our part, that no one went to the meeting. We could only watch the recorded video, and that we hope that in the future, we can at least get one of us going to that video conference each week so we can better understand our tasks and procedures to go through the week. We did have some difficulties kind of getting started and understanding the overall scheme and process that was taking place. Another thing that I think we could be seen as a weakness is depending on more independent research and reading to help each member understand our goals and the outcomes of the meeting. Again, we had a lot of confusion with kind of what to do at certain points and what discussions to be having. Although the book was a great resource, I think we need to look at outside resources to have a better understanding of what we're doing and to be more effective in the overall process. Overall, it was a great meeting. It went a lot smoother though than the first data meeting. And there was no serious challenges besides understanding and figuring out the actual process for data meeting 2. Thank you guys for watching, and I hope you enjoyed.